The Art of the Steal: How Donald Trump is Stealing American Democracy. Introduction. The Conman-in-Chief. Donald Trump is not a conventional politician. He never has been. Unlike leaders who rise through political institutions by mastering governance, policy, and coalition building, Trump built his empire on spectacle, self-promotion, and deception. His career as a businessman, media personality, and eventual president has been defined by a singular principle: winning at all costs. It is this philosophy, one rooted in manipulation, misinformation, and the exploitation of systemic weaknesses, that has allowed him to systematically erode the foundations of American democracy. For Trump, politics has never been about public service. It has never been about strengthening institutions or upholding democratic norms. It has been about power, gaining it, holding on to it, and bending the system to his will. And like any skilled con artist, he knows that perception is more important than reality. If he can convince enough people that the system is rigged, that he alone speaks the truth, and that his enemies are illegitimate, then he can redefine democracy itself in his own image. This book is an examination of how Trump, using the tactics of a lifelong grifter, has orchestrated the most audacious heist in American history: the theft of its democracy. He has not done it alone. He has been aided by enablers in the Republican Party, right-wing media, corporate elites, and millions of supporters who have been drawn into his carefully crafted illusion of victimhood and populist revolt. Through lies, intimidation, and institutional sabotage, he has managed to do what no foreign adversary has ever accomplished: convince millions of Americans that their own democracy is illegitimate. The idea of a stolen election did not begin in 2020. Nor did Trump's authoritarian impulses suddenly emerge when he lost to Joe Biden. This book will trace how Trump laid the groundwork for his attempted coup years in advance, through systematic attacks on truth, calculated assaults on democratic institutions, and an obsession with rewriting the rules to ensure he could never lose. From his rise in the 2016 campaign, where he mastered the art of disinformation, to his presidency, where he surrounded himself with loyalists willing to undermine the rule of law, Trump has worked tirelessly to make himself untouchable. At its core, this is a story about power and deception. Trump's greatest achievement has been convincing millions of Americans that he alone is their savior, that their enemies are his enemies, and that the entire system, Congress, the courts, the media, the voting process itself, is corrupt and illegitimate if it does not serve him. This is not a new tactic. History is filled with authoritarian figures who have used the same playbook. But what makes Trump unique is the way he has done it in plain sight, with the full backing of a major political party in a nation that once prided itself on being the world's leading democracy. This book will break down the key elements of Trump's assault on democracy, from his war on truth and media, to his court-packing and political purges, to his ultimate goal of dismantling the very mechanisms that could remove him from power. It will examine how the Republican Party, instead of standing as a check on his abuses, became his accomplice. And it will explore the long-term consequences of his actions, not just for the United States, but for democracy worldwide. In the end, the question is not whether Trump will steal American democracy. The question is whether he already has. Coming next, Chapter 1. The Big Lie and the Cult of Personality. Donald Trump's greatest weapon has never been policy expertise, strategic governance, or even an ability to unite people under a common cause. His true power lies in his ability to construct an alternate reality, one where facts are malleable, truth is subjective, and he alone holds the answers. Nowhere is this more evident than in the big lie, the calculated falsehood that the 2020 presidential election was stolen. This lie, more than any other, has become the foundation of his enduring influence, a rallying cry for his most devoted followers, and a direct assault on the legitimacy of American democracy. The anatomy of the big lie. Trump did not invent the concept of the big lie. Authoritarian leaders throughout history have relied on similar tactics. The strategy is simple but effective. Tell a massive falsehood, repeat it constantly, and insist that anyone who contradicts it is part of a vast conspiracy. The bigger and more outrageous the lie, the harder it is for people to refute, because its sheer audacity makes it difficult to believe that someone in power would say it unless it had some basis in truth. The claim that the 2020 election was stolen did not emerge after the votes were counted. Trump began laying the groundwork for this lie well before Election Day. He repeatedly claimed that mail-in ballots were fraudulent, that the election would be rigged against him, and that he could only lose if the system was manipulated. This preemptive narrative ensured that his base would distrust any outcome that did not declare him the winner. When the results came in and Biden was declared president-elect, Trump and his allies immediately launched a coordinated campaign to overturn the outcome, despite overwhelming evidence that the election was fair and secure. The role of right-wing media and social media. A lie of this scale requires amplification, and Trump had no shortage of enablers willing to spread his falsehoods. Fox News, Newsmax, OAN, and countless right-wing talk radio hosts became megaphones for his claims, giving airtime to conspiracy theorists who pushed baseless allegations of voter fraud. At the same time, social media platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube became breeding grounds for misinformation, where millions of users shared and reinforced the false narrative of a stolen election. The result was an alternate universe in which Trump supporters were convinced that Biden's presidency was illegitimate. Even when Trump's own Justice Department, led by Attorney General William Barr, declared there was no widespread voter fraud, the former president's followers dismissed the findings as part of the conspiracy. When state and local Republican election officials confirmed that the results were accurate, they were harassed, threatened, and in some cases, forced into hiding. January 6th, the logical conclusion of the big lie. The insurrection at the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, was the inevitable outcome of the big lie. When people are convinced that their government has been stolen from them, violence becomes a justified response. Trump knew this. His speech that morning, urging his supporters to fight like hell and march to the Capitol, was not the call for peaceful protest that he later claimed. It was a calculated attempt to use mob pressure to overturn a lawful election. The insurrectionists who stormed the Capitol carried Trump flags, chanted his name, and sought to disrupt the certification of Biden's victory. They attacked police officers, broke into congressional offices, and erected a gallows, calling for the execution of elected officials who refused to bow to Trump's demands. The fact that Trump watched the chaos unfold on television for hours before finally telling his supporters to go home underscores his complicity. The cult of personality, why the lie sticks. Trump's ability to maintain control over his supporters, even after leaving office, is rooted in his cult of personality. Unlike traditional politicians who rely on party loyalty or ideological alignment, Trump commands a following that is deeply personal. His supporters do not just believe in his policies, they believe in him as an almost messianic figure. This devotion allows him to rewrite reality in real time. When he claims that the media is the enemy of the people, his supporters dismiss any negative coverage as fake news. When courts, including those with Trump-appointed judges, reject his election fraud claims, his followers believe the judiciary is corrupt. When Republicans who once supported him, like Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, criticize his actions, they are branded as traitors. The power of Trump's cult-like influence is that no amount of factual evidence can shake the faith of his most ardent believers. The more he is attacked by the media, the justice system, and political opponents, the more his followers see him as a martyr. His legal troubles, from impeachment to criminal indictments, are not seen as legitimate consequences of his actions, but as proof that he is fighting a corrupt system. The dangerous legacy of the big lie. The big lie is not just a false claim about a single election, it is a long-term strategy to undermine democracy itself. If a significant portion of the population no longer trusts elections, then the very foundation of democratic governance collapses. Trump's insistence that elections are rigged unless he wins paves the way for future power grabs, where election results can be challenged or overturned based on political pressure rather than facts. This erosion of trust is already evident. In 2022, Trump-backed candidates across the country ran on platforms of election integrity, a euphemism for implementing laws that make it harder to vote, particularly for marginalized communities. Some state legislatures, controlled by Republicans, have even proposed giving themselves the power to override election results if they disagree with the outcome. The danger is clear. If Trump or someone like him wins the presidency in 2024 with the same disregard for democratic norms, the U.S. may no longer function as a democracy. The seeds of authoritarianism have already been planted. The question now is whether they will take root. Chapter 2: Attacking the media and controlling the narrative. From the moment Donald Trump descended the golden escalator at Trump Tower to announce his candidacy in 2015, he waged war on the press. Unlike past presidents who may have had contentious relationships with journalists, Trump saw the media not as a watchdog of democracy, but as a personal enemy. His relentless assault on the free press was not just about avoiding negative coverage. It was a calculated strategy to delegitimize any source of information that contradicted his version of reality. By branding the mainstream media as fake news and the enemy of the people, Trump created an alternative information ecosystem where only the voices that praised him were considered legitimate. This tactic, borrowed from authoritarian leaders, allowed him to maintain control over his base, silence dissent, and reshape American political discourse. The Trump Media Playbook, a war on truth. Trump's approach to the media was unprecedented in its scope and aggression. While politicians have long criticized negative coverage, Trump took it to another level by attempting to discredit journalism itself. His attacks followed a clear pattern. 1. Deny the truth. When confronted with facts that painted him in a bad light, Trump's first instinct was to deny reality outright. Whether it was the size of his inauguration crowd, his phone call with Ukraine's president, or his handling of COVID-19, he reflexively dismissed any reports that contradicted his narrative. 2. Discredit the source. Rather than refuting specific claims, Trump would attack the credibility of the journalists reporting the story. He called reporters scum, accused them of being biased against him, and encouraged his supporters to view them as enemies. 3. Create an alternative narrative. When faced with damning evidence, Trump and his allies would construct an alternative version of events. If the Russia investigation exposed campaign wrongdoing, he called it a witch hunt. If the press reported on his mishandling of the pandemic, he accused them of wanting America to fail. 4. Flood the zone with misinformation. Instead of defending himself with facts, Trump often overwhelmed the public with a barrage of conflicting and misleading statements. This created confusion, making it difficult for people to discern the truth. 5. Punish and reward. Trump rewarded media outlets that praised him, such as Fox News and OANN, while freezing out or attacking those that held him accountable. This sent a clear message: support me and you will be elevated. Challenge me and you will be destroyed. The rise of fake news and the death of accountability. One of Trump's most effective tactics was his relentless use of the term fake news. By applying this label to any coverage he disliked, he convinced millions of Americans that the mainstream media was fundamentally untrustworthy. This had several dangerous consequences. It provided a built-in defense against scandals. No matter how serious the allegation, be it sexual misconduct, corruption, or obstruction of justice, Trump could simply dismiss it as fake news and avoid accountability. It fueled conspiracy theories. When mainstream news outlets were discredited, Americans increasingly turned to alternative sources like QAnon forums, far-right blogs, and propaganda networks. Many of these sources were rife with conspiracy theories, including the claim that Trump was secretly fighting a deep state cabal of satanic pedophiles. It eroded trust in democratic institutions. By extension, if the media was lying about Trump, then so were the courts, the FBI, and the electoral process. This skepticism set the stage for the big lie in the January 6 insurrection. How right-wing media became Trump's propaganda arm. Trump's war on the press would not have been successful without the full cooperation of right-wing media, particularly Fox News. Over the course of his presidency, Fox transformed from a conservative-leaning news network into a full-blown propaganda machine, often acting as a state-run media outlet rather than an independent news organization. Fox News anchors openly coordinated with Trump. Sean Hannity was not just a supporter, he was an unofficial advisor who spoke with Trump regularly. Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham played similar roles, shaping policy debates and reinforcing Trump's talking points. Misinformation spread unchecked. False claims about voter fraud, COVID-19, and the Russia investigation were given extensive airtime, often without correction. Dissenters were purged. Fox News reporters who fact-checked Trump, such as Chris Wallace and Shep Smith, faced backlash and either left or were marginalized. When Fox momentarily broke with Trump, such as when they correctly called Arizona for Biden in 2020, he turned on them, promoting even more extreme outlets like OANN and Newsmax. This cycle ensured that his base only consumed media that reinforced his worldview. Social media, the ultimate weapon. While traditional right-wing media amplified Trump's lies, social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook allowed him to speak directly to millions of followers without a filter. Twitter as a megaphone. Trump's Twitter account was his most powerful weapon, allowing him to spread falsehoods at an unprecedented scale. He used it to attack political opponents, fire officials, announce policy changes, and incite violence, as seen before the January 6th insurrection. Facebook's role in disinformation. Facebook's algorithm prioritized sensational, emotionally charged content, making it the perfect breeding ground for Trump's brand of misinformation. Groups dedicated to election fraud conspiracies flourished, radicalizing many of his supporters. The ban and the fallout. After January 6th, Trump was banned from Twitter and Facebook. While this cut off his direct line to his base, it also reinforced his supporters' belief that big tech was conspiring against them. The creation of Truth Social ensured that the cycle of disinformation would continue. The global consequences of Trump's war on the press. Trump's demonization of the media did not just affect the United States, it emboldened authoritarian leaders worldwide. Dictators in countries like Russia, China, Brazil, and Hungary adopted Trump's fake news rhetoric to justify cracking down on journalists. His attacks on the press normalized the idea that leaders should be above scrutiny, weakening the free press as a check on power globally. Even after leaving office, Trump's influence continues to be felt. The distrust he cultivated remains deeply embedded in American political culture, paving the way for future leaders to exploit the same tactics. If the free press is permanently weakened, democracy itself becomes unsustainable. Conclusion. The damage is done. Trump's war on the media was never just about personal grievances. It was about control. By undermining the credibility of journalism, he made himself the sole arbiter of truth among his supporters. This tactic, once reserved for dictators and despots, has now been imported into the American political system. The question moving forward is whether democracy can survive in a society where half the country no longer believes in facts. If future leaders continue to follow Trump's blueprint, the press may never regain its role as the fourth estate, and the public may never again have a shared understanding of reality. The media is not perfect, and bias exists on all sides, but without a functioning press, democracy cannot hold leaders accountable. Trump understood this better than anyone, and he exploited it to his full advantage. The next battle for democracy will not just be fought at the ballot box. It will be fought in the realm of truth itself. Chapter 3. Undermining the Rule of Law. Donald Trump did not just challenge the rule of law, he actively sought to bend it to his will. His approach to governance was not rooted in upholding the Constitution, respecting legal norms, or ensuring justice for all. Instead, it was about power, loyalty, and personal protection. Throughout his presidency and beyond, he worked to undermine the justice system, attack institutions designed to hold leaders accountable, and place himself above the law. This chapter will explore how Trump dismantled the guardrails of democracy, eroded trust in legal institutions, and manipulated the system to protect himself and punish his enemies. His actions not only threatened the stability of the American legal system, but also set a dangerous precedent for future leaders who might seek to follow his authoritarian playbook. Trump's view of the law, a tool for power, not justice. From the beginning of his presidency, it was clear that Trump viewed the legal system as a weapon, one to be wielded against his opponents while shielding himself from scrutiny. Unlike past presidents who at least paid lip service to the idea that no one is above the law, Trump openly suggested that laws should not apply to him. He repeatedly questioned why he could not use the Department of Justice, DOJ, to investigate his political enemies, including Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. He dismissed any legal challenges against him as witch hunts or hoaxes. He believed that government officials, including the Attorney General and FBI Director, should operate as his personal enforcers rather than independent figures upholding the Constitution. This mindset defined his approach to law enforcement, leading to some of the most blatant abuses of power in modern American history. Weaponizing the Department of Justice. One of Trump's most dangerous moves was his repeated attempts to transform the DOJ into a political tool that served him personally rather than the American people. Demanding loyalty from the Attorney General. Trump saw the Attorney General not as an independent legal authority, but as a protector of his personal interests. He turned on Jeff Sessions for recusing himself from the Russia investigation and later pressured Bill Barr to act as his legal shield. Interfering in investigations, Trump attempted to obstruct the Russia investigation multiple times, as outlined in the Mueller report. He also pressured the DOJ to go easy on allies like Michael Flynn and Roger Stone while pushing for investigations into his adversaries. Purging and replacing officials. When FBI Director James Comey refused to pledge loyalty and continue investigating Trump's political enemies, he was fired. Trump replaced key DOJ officials with loyalists, ensuring that the department operated in his interests rather than the rule of law. By the time his presidency ended, Trump had successfully blurred the lines between justice and personal vendetta, setting a precedent that could permanently damage the DOJ's credibility. Pardons as political favors. The presidential pardon power is meant to be a mechanism of mercy, used in rare cases to correct injustices. Trump, however, turned it into a tool of corruption, using pardons to reward loyalists and protect himself from legal consequences. Pardoning political allies, Trump granted clemency to individuals convicted of crimes committed on his behalf, including Roger Stone, Paul Manafort, and Michael Flynn. Shielding war criminals, he pardoned soldiers convicted of war crimes, signaling that he valued political loyalty over the rule of law, even in military conduct. Considering preemptive pardons. In his final days in office, Trump reportedly considered issuing preemptive pardons for himself, his family, and his close allies, effectively an admission of guilt. By using the pardon power in such a brazenly self-serving way, Trump further eroded the idea that justice applies equally to all Americans. Stacking the courts to serve his agenda. Trump's influence over the judicial system extended beyond the DOJ. He also worked to reshape the federal judiciary in his image. Packing the Supreme Court. With the help of Mitch McConnell, Trump appointed 3 conservative justices, Neil Gorsuch, Brett Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett, shifting the ideological balance of the court for generations. Flooding the lower courts. He appointed more than 200 federal judges, many of whom were young, ideologically extreme, and lacked traditional qualifications. Ensuring loyalty over competence. Many of Trump's judicial appointees had close ties to conservative political groups, raising concerns that they would rule based on ideology rather than legal precedent. The result was a judiciary increasingly shaped by political calculations rather than impartial legal interpretation, making it easier for Trump and his allies to challenge election results and undermine democratic norms. The attack on the FBI and intelligence agencies. Trump's disdain for independent institutions extended to the FBI and intelligence community, which he saw as obstacles to his power rather than essential components of national security. Dismissing Russian interference as a hoax. Even after U.S. intelligence agencies confirmed that Russia interfered in the 2016 election, Trump repeatedly dismissed their findings and sided with Vladimir Putin. Smearing the FBI as corrupt. When the FBI investigated his campaign's ties to Russia, Trump and his allies falsely painted the agency as part of a deep state conspiracy. Retaliation against whistleblowers. He fired or smeared officials who provided damaging testimony, including Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Vindman, who testified in Trump's first impeachment trial. By undermining the credibility of intelligence agencies, Trump not only weakened U.S. national security, but also gave foreign adversaries an opening to exploit America's internal divisions, encouraging lawlessness among his followers. Trump's disregard for the rule of law was not just about protecting himself, it also extended to encouraging lawlessness among his supporters. Inciting violence, from telling rally-goers to knock the crap out of protesters to calling on militias to stand back and stand by, Trump repeatedly used inflammatory rhetoric that emboldened extremists. January 6th insurrection. By convincing his followers that the election was stolen, Trump incited a violent attack on the U.S. Capitol in a last-ditch effort to overturn the results. Pushing for political retribution. Even after leaving office, he has called for investigations into his enemies, threatened officials who opposed him, and continued to push false claims about the election. His willingness to encourage lawlessness and political violence represents one of the most dangerous legacies of his presidency. The lasting damage to American democracy. Trump's systematic assault on the rule of law has left lasting scars on the U.S. legal system. Distrust in institutions. Millions of Americans now believe that the DOJ, FBI, and courts are corrupt, making it harder for these institutions to function effectively. A dangerous precedent for future presidents. Trump's willingness to ignore legal constraints has set a dangerous precedent. If future leaders follow his example, democratic norms could further erode. A legal system in crisis. Even after leaving office, Trump continues to test the limits of the law, whether through legal battles over classified documents, election interference cases, or attempts to shield himself from prosecution. The question now is whether American democracy can recover. Can institutions that were once viewed as pillars of justice regain public trust? Or has Trump permanently rewritten the rules of political accountability? The answer will determine whether the United States remains a nation of laws, or whether it becomes a country where power, rather than justice, dictates who is held accountable. Chapter 4. The GOP's Surrender. The Republican Party once prided itself on being the party of conservative principles, limited government, fiscal responsibility, national security, and law and order. But under Donald Trump, the GOP transformed into something entirely different. A personality cult centered around one man rather than a set of ideas. Trump did not seize control of the Republican Party by force. He did something more insidious. He exposed its weaknesses, exploited its hunger for power, and turned it into an extension of his will. He demanded absolute loyalty, purged those who opposed him, and made it clear that the GOP was no longer a party of ideas, but a tool for his personal ambitions. This chapter will explore how the Republican Party abandoned its principles, embraced authoritarianism, and allowed itself to become complicit in the erosion of American democracy. How the GOP became Trump's party. Before Trump, the Republican Party was deeply divided between its traditional establishment, its Tea Party insurgents, and a growing populist base that felt alienated by Washington politics. Trump capitalized on this division, using his outsider status to position himself as a populist warrior against the political elite. 2016, the party's reluctant embrace. When Trump first ran for president, many Republican leaders saw him as a joke or a temporary nuisance. Figures like Mitt Romney and Lindsey Graham warned that he was unfit for office. But as Trump gained momentum, winning primary after primary, the GOP establishment faced a choice: resist him and risk alienating their base, or embrace him and ride his popularity to victory. Most chose the latter. 2017-2020, the GOP's total submission. Once Trump became president, the party fully aligned itself with him. Even when he broke conservative norms, by embracing deficit spending, alienating U.S. allies, and challenging the legitimacy of elections, Republicans in Congress remained silent or actively defended him. 2021 present, the purge of dissenters. After Trump lost the 2020 election, the Republican Party had an opportunity to move on. Instead, it doubled down on its loyalty to him. Lawmakers who challenged Trump's election lies, such as Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, were excommunicated. Those who supported his false claims were rewarded with party endorsements and campaign funding. What started as reluctant acceptance turned into blind devotion. Today, the Republican Party is no longer defined by conservatism. It is defined by Trumpism. The death of conservative principles. Before Trump, the Republican Party had core ideological commitments that defined its policy positions. Under Trump, these principles were abandoned in favor of whatever benefited him personally. 1. From fiscal responsibility to reckless spending. Traditional conservatives champion balanced budgets and reducing the national debt. Trump's presidency added nearly $8 trillion to the national debt, largely through tax cuts for corporations and the wealthy, which Republicans justified as necessary to boost the economy. Number 2. From free trade to economic nationalism. The GOP historically supported free trade agreements, believing they promoted global economic growth. Trump launched trade wars, imposed tariffs, and abandoned long-standing trade partnerships, hurting U.S. farmers and businesses. 3. From law and order to selective justice. The GOP positioned itself as the party of law enforcement and national security. Under Trump, Republicans defended the January 6 insurrectionists, dismissed Russian election interference, and attacked the FBI when it investigated Trump's wrongdoing. 4. From strong alliances to isolationism. Past Republican leaders, from Ronald Reagan to George W. Bush, championed U.S. leadership on the global stage. Trump repeatedly undermined NATO, alienated European allies, and cozied up to autocrats like Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un. In each of these areas, the GOP sacrificed long-standing principles in order to maintain Trump's favor. The party that once claimed to stand for values had become a hollow vessel, guided only by his whims.
Loyalty over country.
The party's betrayal of democracy. The most dangerous aspect of the GOP's submission to Trump is its willingness to abandon democracy itself, refusing to accept election results. Even after Trump lost the 2020 election, most Republican lawmakers refused to acknowledge Biden's victory. Over 100 GOP members of Congress voted to overturn the results, and state legislatures across the country passed new laws restricting voting access based on Trump's lies. Defending the January 6 insurrectionists, instead of condemning the attack on the Capitol, many Republicans downplayed it. Some even referred to the rioters as political prisoners.
Blocking investigations into Trump's corruption. Whether it was the Russia investigation, Trump's attempt to pressure Ukraine into investigating Biden, or his financial scandals, congressional Republicans consistently shielded him from accountability. Rather than acting as a check on Trump's abuses of power, the GOP enabled and encouraged them. The purge of anti-Trump conservatives. For decades, the Republican Party included a range of voices, from traditional conservatives to moderates. Under Trump, dissent was no longer tolerated. Liz Cheney, a staunch conservative and daughter of former Vice President Dick Cheney, she was expelled from GOP leadership for condemning Trump's election lies. Adam Kinzinger, a military veteran and former congressman, he was one of the few Republicans willing to investigate January 6th, leading to his retirement from politics. Jeff Flake and Mitt Romney, both vocal Trump critics, they were vilified by their own party for speaking out against his authoritarian tendencies. This purge ensured that only the most loyal Trump supporters remained in positions of power, further entrenching his control over the GOP. The future of the Republican Party. Trump's dynasty? As Trump prepares for a possible return to power in 2025, the Republican Party is more loyal to him than ever. Candidates must pledge fealty. In GOP primaries, candidates who challenge Trump's election lies or criticize his leadership are almost always defeated. A cult, not a party. The GOP now functions less like a traditional political party and more like a personality cult, where loyalty to Trump outweighs policy, governance, or even electoral viability. Trump's family as political heirs. Figures like Donald Trump Jr. and Ivanka Trump have been positioned as future leaders of the party, ensuring that Trumpism survives even if Trump himself does not run again. With each election cycle, the party becomes more extreme, more conspiratorial, and more detached from democratic principles. Conclusion: the GOP's self-destruction. By surrendering to Trump, the Republican Party has not just abandoned its traditional principles, it has also placed itself on a path towards self-destruction. Alienating moderate voters. While Trump retains a strong hold on the GOP base, his influence has cost the party key elections. Swing voters, suburban Republicans, and independents have increasingly turned against Trump-backed candidates. Becoming a party of authoritarianism, instead of adapting to the changing political landscape, the GOP has embraced voter suppression, election denialism, and attacks on democratic institutions, risking permanent decline. If Trumpism continues to dominate the GOP, it may eventually become unelectable outside of deep red states, leading to its long-term collapse. The Republican Party was once an institution that stood for conservative values and governance. Under Trump, it has become a movement defined by one man's ego, corruption, and authoritarian impulses. The question now is whether it can ever reclaim its identity, or whether it will remain a vehicle for Trumpism, even after he is gone. Chapter 5: Packing the Courts and Dismantling Checks and Balances. The U.S. government was designed with a system of checks and balances to prevent any one branch from gaining too much power. The judiciary, particularly the Supreme Court, was intended to be an impartial arbiter, standing above politics to uphold the Constitution. But under Donald Trump, the courts became a tool for consolidating power, ensuring that laws and policies favored his interests rather than those of the American people. Trump's reshaping of the judiciary was not just about appointing conservative judges. It was about creating a legal system that would shield him from accountability, protect his allies, and dismantle the safeguards of democracy. This chapter will examine how Trump and his Republican enablers stacked the courts, undermined judicial independence, and used the legal system to erode democratic institutions. The Trump-McConnell alliance, a judicial power grab. One of Trump's most lasting impacts on American democracy was his ability to fill the courts with ideological loyalists. This was only possible due to his partnership with Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who orchestrated an unprecedented takeover of the judiciary, blocking Obama's nominees. Before Trump even took office, McConnell set the stage for a judicial coup by refusing to hold hearings for Obama's nominees. Most notably, he blocked Merrick Garland's nomination to the Supreme Court in 2016, claiming it was too close to an election, only to rush through Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation weeks before the 2020 election. Speeding up judicial confirmations, McConnell eliminated the filibuster for Supreme Court nominations, allowing Trump's picks to be confirmed with a simple majority. He also pushed through lower court nominations at an unprecedented rate. Ignoring qualifications, many of Trump's judicial appointees were rated as not qualified by the American Bar Association, yet were confirmed anyway because of their ideological alignment with Trump's agenda. By the end of his presidency, Trump had appointed 3 Supreme Court justices, 54 appellate judges, and 174 district court judges, a staggering number that ensured his influence over the judiciary would last for decades. The Supreme Court, a political weapon. The Supreme Court, once seen as an institution above partisan politics, became a key tool in Trump's assault on democracy. Neil Gorsuch, 2017, filled the seat that McConnell stole from Obama, cementing a conservative majority. Brett Kavanaugh, 2018, pushed through despite sexual assault allegations, with Trump defending him as a victim of a witch hunt. Amy Coney Barrett, 2020, confirmed in record time after Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's death, despite McConnell's previous refusal to consider election year nominations under Obama. With these appointments, the court shifted sharply to the right, issuing rulings that rolled back abortion rights, voting protections, and environmental regulations. Trump's justices played a critical role in overturning Roe v. Wade, a long-standing conservative goal that Trump had promised to achieve. But Trump's goal was not just to create a conservative court. It was to create a court that would protect him personally. He openly demanded loyalty from his appointees, expecting them to rule in his favor on election disputes, investigations into his conduct, and challenges to executive power. While the Supreme Court ultimately upheld the results of the 2020 election, Trump's influence over the judiciary remains a powerful force in shaping the country's legal landscape. Packing the lower courts, the next generation of Trump judges. While the Supreme Court gets the most attention, Trump's lower court appointments may be even more consequential. Federal judges serve lifetime appointments, meaning Trump's impact on the judiciary will last for generations. Many were deeply partisan. Trump openly prioritized ideological loyalty over experience, selecting judges who had histories of working for far-right organizations. Some were shockingly unqualified. Several appointees had never tried a case in court before being given lifetime judicial power. They will shape policy for decades. Trump's judges are already issuing rulings that undermine voting rights, environmental protections, and labor laws. The long-term consequences are clear. Even if Trump never holds office again, his judges will continue to legislate from the bench, advancing his agenda and obstructing efforts to restore democratic norms. Undermining the Department of Justice, Trump's assault on the legal system was not limited to the judiciary. He also politicized the Department of Justice, DOJ, to serve his personal interests. Demanding loyalty from attorneys general, Trump viewed the DOJ as his personal law firm, expecting attorneys general to protect him and investigate his enemies. Jeff Sessions lost favor for recusing himself from the Russia investigation, while Bill Barr acted as Trump's enforcer, intervening in cases to protect Trump's allies. Interfering in prosecutions, Trump pressured the DOJ to drop cases against his convicted associates, including Michael Flynn and Roger Stone, while pushing for investigations into Joe Biden, Hillary Clinton, and other political opponents. Attacking career prosecutors. When prosecutors pursued cases against Trump's businesses, he accused them of being part of a deep state conspiracy, further undermining public trust in the legal system. By turning the DOJ into a political weapon, Trump set a dangerous precedent for future presidents to use federal law enforcement for personal gain. Assaulting checks and balances. Beyond stacking the courts and politicizing the DOJ, Trump systematically dismantled other mechanisms designed to hold the president accountable. Ignoring congressional oversight. Trump refused to comply with congressional subpoenas, blocked witnesses from testifying, and treated impeachment proceedings as a joke. Retaliating against whistleblowers. Officials who exposed corruption, such as Lot Cole, Alexander Vindman, and Inspector General Michael Atkinson, were fired or smeared. Defying the Constitution, Trump attempted to rule by executive order, bypassing Congress to push through policies that often faced legal challenges. These actions weakened the very foundations of American democracy, making it easier for future leaders to operate without accountability. The lasting consequences. Trump's manipulation of the legal system has left the U.S. with a judiciary that is deeply partisan. Many judges now see their role not as upholding the law, but as advancing a political agenda. Hostile to democracy. Courts packed with Trump appointees are rolling back voting rights, making it harder for marginalized communities to participate in elections. Resistant to reform. Because judges have lifetime appointments, undoing Trump's influence will take decades, if it can be undone at all. Trump exploited every weakness in the legal system to consolidate power. Even though he is out of office, the damage he inflicted remains, ensuring that the fight for democracy is far from over. Conclusion: a legal system in crisis. The American legal system was built to ensure that no one is above the law, but Trump exposed its vulnerabilities. He stacked the courts with ideological allies who will shape policy for decades. He turned the DOJ into a political weapon, shielding himself while attacking opponents. He ignored legal constraints, setting a precedent for future presidents to operate without oversight. Trump did not just use the legal system for his own benefit. He fundamentally altered it, weakening the checks and balances that prevent authoritarian rule. The question now is whether American democracy can recover, or if Trump's judicial takeover has permanently tilted the system in favor of those who seek power at any cost. Chapter 6: Weaponizing Government Against Opponents. Donald Trump's presidency was defined by a relentless effort to transform the U.S. government into a tool for his own personal and political gain. Rather than treating the government as an institution meant to serve the American people, Trump viewed it as a weapon to protect his allies, punish his enemies, and cement his grip on power. This chapter will explore how Trump attempted to corrupt federal agencies, use law enforcement as a personal enforcer, silence whistleblowers, and target political opponents, all in a bid to reshape the government into an authoritarian extension of his own will, turning the presidency into a shield for corruption. Most presidents attempt to maintain a degree of separation between their personal interests and the functions of government. Trump did the opposite. He openly used the presidency to protect himself, his family, and his business empire. Blocking investigations into himself, Trump viewed any legal scrutiny as a political attack, refusing to comply with subpoenas and demanding loyalty from officials investigating his conduct. Financial conflicts of interest. Unlike previous presidents, Trump refused to divest from his business empire, leading to constant ethical concerns about how his policies benefited his personal finances. Pressuring the DOJ to drop cases against his allies, Trump repeatedly sought to intervene in legal cases against his associates, including Michael Flynn, Paul Manafort, and Roger Stone, while demanding investigations into his opponents. His view of government was simple: laws applied to everyone except him and his inner circle.
The DOJ as Trump's personal law firm. One of Trump's most dangerous abuses of power was his effort to turn the Department of Justice, DOJ, into his personal legal defense team. Demanding loyalty from attorneys general, Trump publicly humiliated Jeff Sessions for recusing himself from the Russia investigation, eventually replacing him with William Barr, who acted as Trump's legal shield. Interfering in investigations, Barr downplayed the findings of the Mueller report, tried to discredit the Russia investigation, and intervened in cases to protect Trump's allies. Attempting to use the DOJ to overturn the 2020 election. After losing the election, Trump pressured DOJ officials to declare the election corrupt so that Republican-led states could overturn Biden's victory. When they refused, he attempted to install a loyalist, Jeffrey Clark, to carry out his demands. These actions eroded the DOJ's credibility and set a precedent that future presidents could use the justice system as a political weapon. Silencing whistleblowers and government critics. Trump did not tolerate dissent, especially from within his own administration. He viewed government employees not as public servants, but as loyalists who either served him or were enemies to be crushed. Retaliation. Against whistleblowers. Letcall Alexander Vindman, a decorated military officer, was fired after testifying against Trump in the first impeachment trial over his attempt to pressure Ukraine into investigating Joe Biden. Targeting inspectors general. Trump fired multiple inspectors general, the watchdogs responsible for exposing government corruption, because they reported wrongdoing in his administration. Dismissing officials who refused to break the law. When government officials refused to carry out illegal orders, such as helping him overturn the election, they were fired and replaced with loyalists. This purge of independent voices ensured that only the most obedient and sycophantic figures remained in power, further undermining the integrity of the government. Weaponizing federal agencies against opponents. Trump did not stop at controlling the DOJ. He also attempted to use federal agencies to target his political enemies and protect his allies. Politicizing intelligence agencies, Trump repeatedly pressured intelligence officials to produce reports that aligned with his false narratives, whether about Russia, China, or election fraud. Ordering the IRS to target opponents. While there is no definitive proof, concerns were raised that Trump attempted to use the IRS to investigate and punish critics. Threatening military leaders. Trump clashed with top military officials, particularly those who resisted his authoritarian impulses. He was enraged when General Mark Milley opposed his desire to use the military to suppress Black Lives Matter protests. By treating the federal government as his personal enforcement squad, Trump further blurred the lines between democracy and dictatorship. The attempt to overturn the 2020 election. Perhaps the most egregious example of Trump weaponizing the government was his attempted coup after losing the 2020 election. Pressuring state officials. Trump called Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, demanding that he find enough votes to overturn Biden's win in the state. Attempting to install loyalists in the DOJ. When DOJ officials refused to declare the election fraudulent, Trump tried to replace the acting attorney general with Jeffrey Clark, a little-known lawyer who was willing to push his false claims. Encouraging GOP-led legislatures to reject election results. Trump pressured Republican-controlled state legislatures to throw out their state's election results and appoint pro-Trump electors instead. Inciting the January 6th insurrection. After exhausting legal avenues, Trump summoned his supporters to Washington, gave a fiery speech filled with falsehoods, and directed them to march on the Capitol to stop the certification of Biden's victory. This was not just an attack on an election, it was an attack on the very foundation of American democracy. targeting political opponents and critics. Trump's authoritarian impulses were further demonstrated by his obsession with punishing his political enemies. Hillary Clinton, Trump frequently called for Clinton to be jailed, leading "lock her up" chants at rallies despite no evidence of criminal wrongdoing. Joe Biden and Hunter Biden, Trump and his allies fabricated a scandal around Hunter Biden, pressuring foreign governments to investigate him to damage Joe Biden's candidacy. The media, Trump regularly threatened to revoke press credentials, sued journalists, and even suggested that media outlets should be prosecuted for fake news. These efforts were not about policy disagreements, they were about destroying opposition in a way reminiscent of authoritarian regimes. Project 2025, the plan for total government takeover. As Trump prepares for a potential return to power in 2025, he and his allies are already planning an even more aggressive use of government to cement his control. Firing thousands of civil servants, Trump's allies have drawn up plans to replace career government officials with Trump loyalists, ensuring total obedience. Expanding executive power. Trump has promised to further weaken Congress and the courts, consolidating power within the presidency. Revoking the independence of the DOJ and FBI, future DOJ and FBI leadership would be expected to prosecute Trump's enemies while shielding him and his allies from legal consequences. If successful, Trump's second term could mark the end of democratic governance in the United States. Conclusion: a government built to serve one man. Trump's presidency demonstrated the fragility of American democracy, how easily government institutions could be manipulated and turned against the people they were meant to serve. He turned the DOJ into a political weapon. He purged officials who upheld the law. He attempted to overturn an election through force. He laid the groundwork for an authoritarian takeover if he returns to power. These are not the actions of a democratic leader. They are the actions of a man who sees the presidency as an instrument of personal power, not public service. The question now is whether the U.S. government can recover from Trump's abuses, or if his playbook will be used again and again by future leaders who prioritize power over democracy. Chapter 7. The Playbook for 2025. Donald Trump's presidency was not just an anomaly, it was a trial run. His 4 years in office revealed how much damage a president with authoritarian instincts could inflict on American democracy. But his failures, impeachments, election losses, and resistance from independent institutions also provided a blueprint for how to consolidate power more effectively in a second term. Now, Trump and his allies are openly planning for his return to power in 2025. Their strategy, outlined in a document known as Project 2025, is a roadmap for dismantling democratic institutions, eliminating opposition, and ensuring Trump, or someone like him, never loses power again. This chapter will examine how Trump's potential second term would be different from his first, the radical plans already in motion, and why a second Trump presidency could mark the end of American democracy as we know it. Learning from the past, Trump's mistakes and fixes. In his first term, Trump faced obstacles that prevented him from fully executing his authoritarian vision. He and his allies have identified these obstacles and are preparing to eliminate them in 2025. Obstacle number 1. The deep state, career government officials. What happened in Term 1? Trump was often frustrated by career bureaucrats in agencies like the State Department, the DOJ, and the FBI who resisted his most radical orders. Whistleblowers, inspectors general, and military officials refused to carry out unlawful directives. The plan for Term 2, mass firings of tens of thousands of civil servants who are not personally loyal to Trump, replacing them with hand-picked loyalists who will obey orders without question. Stripping government agencies of independence, ensuring all federal employees serve Trump, not the Constitution. Obstacle number 2. The DOJ and FBI's independence. What happened in Term 1? Despite Trump's demands, the DOJ sometimes acted independently, refusing to fully protect him from investigations. The FBI and intelligence agencies pushed back against Trump's attempts to suppress unfavorable reports. The plan for Term 2. The DOJ FBI will be purged of non-loyalists and run by figures who pledge total allegiance to Trump. Criminal investigations into Trump will be shut down immediately. The FBI and DOJ will be used to target political opponents, including Biden, the media, and anyone who criticizes Trump. Obstacle number 3. The courts occasionally ruled against him. What happened in Term 1? Some Trump executive orders, like the Muslim travel ban, were struck down by the courts. The Supreme Court did not overturn the 2020 election for him. The plan for Term 2. Continue stacking the courts with even more extreme loyalists. Work with Republican state legislatures to weaken judicial independence. Use executive orders to bypass Congress and the courts altogether. Obstacle number 4. The military and law enforcement didn't go far enough. What happened in Term 1? The military refused to be used as a political tool during Black Lives Matter protests. Some officials condemned Trump's handling of January 6. The plan for Term 2. Install loyalists in key Pentagon positions who will follow Trump's orders without hesitation. Use federal law enforcement to crack down on protests, political opponents, and journalists. Prepare for the possibility of martial law or emergency powers to maintain control. Trump's team has studied what went wrong in his first term, and they are determined to remove all obstacles that could stand in his way next time. Project 2025. A blueprint for Authoritarian Rule Project 2025 is a 900-page document developed by the Heritage Foundation and other right-wing think tanks. It outlines how to completely remake the U.S. government in Trump's image. Key goals of Project 2025: 1. Dismantle the civil service. Fire tens of thousands of government employees and replace them with Trump loyalists. Remove independent oversight from agencies like the DOJ, FBI, and State Department. Ensure all federal employees are politically aligned with Trump's vision. 2. Eliminate checks and balances. Expand presidential power to bypass Congress. Use executive orders to enact extreme policies without legislative approval. Limit the court's ability to overrule Trump's decisions. 3. Turn the military and law enforcement into political tools. Replace top Pentagon officials with Trump loyalists. Increase domestic surveillance and law enforcement power to target political opponents. Crack down on protests and opposition movements under the guise of law and order. 4. Criminalize political opposition. Launch DOJ investigations into Biden, Democrats, and the media. Prosecute political enemies on fabricated charges. Suppress voting rights to ensure future elections always favor Trump. 5. Control the media and information. Restrict access to independent journalism, labeling critics as enemies of the state. Increase government power over social media platforms to suppress opposition voices. Use state-run media, like Trump's favorite outlets, to shape the public narrative. Project 2025 is not a policy agenda. It is a hostile takeover plan. It is designed to dismantle democracy itself, ensuring that once Trump or a future Trump-like figure takes power, they never have to give it up. The end of competitive elections? If Trump follows through with Project 2025, future elections may no longer be free or fair. State legislatures could overturn results. Republican-led state legislatures are passing laws that allow them to reject election results they don't like. Voter suppression laws will expand. Laws targeting minority and Democratic voters will ensure Republicans stay in power indefinitely. The Supreme Court will not intervene. A Trump-stacked court will rubber-stamp efforts to undermine democracy. In this scenario, Trump's return could mark the last competitive presidential election in American history. What a second Trump presidency would mean for America. If Trump returns to power in 2025, the consequences will be far more severe than in his first term. The rule of law will be permanently weakened. Elections may no longer be fair. The DOJ, FBI, and military will become political tools. Dissent will be criminalized. America's democratic institutions could collapse entirely. Trump is not hiding his intentions. He is openly promising retribution, authoritarian power, and the elimination of his enemies. The biggest question is whether American democracy is strong enough to resist him, or if it is already too late. Conclusion: the road to autocracy. The stakes of the 2024 election are not just political, they are existential. If Trump returns, he will not make the same mistakes. He will seize more power and ensure he can never be removed again. The institutions that protect democracy will be dismantled. Trump lost power once, but his movement has only grown more extreme. Now, he and his allies are planning their comeback, and this time, they intend to finish the job. Chapter 8: A Future Without Elections. The United States has long prided itself on being a democracy where power is transferred peacefully through elections. But under Donald Trump, the very foundation of that system, free and fair elections, has been systematically undermined. Trump has not only convinced millions of Americans that elections are illegitimate if he loses, but he has also laid the groundwork to ensure that future elections will be rigged in his favor. If Trump or his allies return to power in 2025, America could face a future where elections are no longer competitive and democracy exists in name only. This chapter will examine how Trump and the Republican Party are working to permanently rig the electoral system, ensuring that once they regain control, they never lose it again. The big lie as a weapon against democracy. The greatest threat to future elections is not voter fraud, but the belief that elections themselves cannot be trusted. Trump's relentless promotion of the big lie, the false claim that the 2020 election was stolen, has permanently damaged trust in the electoral process. A majority of Republicans now believe Biden's win was illegitimate. Despite overwhelming evidence that the 2020 election was fair, 70% of Republicans still believe Trump was the rightful winner. Election officials face threats and harassment. Many nonpartisan election workers have resigned after receiving death threats from Trump supporters. GOP-led states have passed laws making it easier to overturn election results. Republican-controlled legislatures in key swing states have given themselves the power to reject election results they don't like. This strategy ensures that Trump can never truly lose again, because if he does, his allies can simply refuse to certify the results. How Republicans are rigging future elections. Trump's efforts to end free elections are already well underway. The Republican Party has adopted a multi-pronged strategy to ensure that future elections always favor them, regardless of how people vote. 1. Voter suppression laws. Republican-led states have passed dozens of laws designed to make it harder for likely Democratic voters, especially Black, Latino, and young voters, to cast ballots. Cutting early voting. States like Georgia and Texas have eliminated early voting days that disproportionately benefit working-class voters. Restricting mail-in ballots. Mail-in voting, which is used by millions of Americans, is now severely restricted in many Republican states. Strict voter ID laws. Harsh ID requirements disproportionately impact minority and low-income voters who may not have the required documentation. The goal is simple: make voting as difficult as possible for groups that tend to vote against Republicans. Number 2. Gerrymandering. Manipulating electoral maps. Even if Republicans lose the popular vote, they can still win elections by redrawing district maps in a way that guarantees GOP victories. Republicans control the majority of state legislatures. This allows them to redraw congressional districts in ways that favor their candidates. Extreme gerrymandering in swing states. In states like Wisconsin and North Carolina, Republicans have drawn maps that lock Democrats out of power even when they win the majority of votes. With gerrymandering, Republicans can win elections without winning a majority of votes, a fundamental distortion of democracy. Number 3. Seizing control of election administration. Trump allies are working to take over the machinery of elections, ensuring that only their preferred results are certified. Installing pro-Trump election officials. In swing states like Arizona and Georgia, Trump-backed candidates have run for Secretary of State, a position that oversees elections. Their goal is to ensure that future elections go Trump's way, regardless of how people vote. Stripping power from nonpartisan election boards. Republican-led legislatures in several states have passed laws that allow them to override election results if they don't like the outcome. If these efforts succeed, future elections could be decided by partisan officials, not by voters. 4. Making it easier to overturn elections. The most dangerous part of Trump's plan is legalizing election theft. Independent state legislature theory. Trump allies are pushing a legal theory that would allow state legislatures to decide elections without any oversight from courts or governors, giving legislatures the power to reject election results. Several states have passed laws allowing legislatures to intervene in the vote certification process, giving them the ability to ignore the will of the voters. This means that even if Trump loses in 2024, Republican-led legislatures could simply refuse to certify the results, keeping him in power. What happens if elections no longer matter? If Trump's plan succeeds, America could become a country where elections still happen, but the results are predetermined. Opposition candidates may still be allowed to run, but the system will be rigged in a way that ensures they can never win. The presidency could become a permanent dictatorship. Once Trump or his successors have full control over the electoral system, they may never leave office. The U.S. could resemble Russia or Hungary. Both countries hold elections, but their leaders, Putin and Orban, have manipulated the system to ensure they never lose. At that point, democracy would be dead in all but name. The global consequences of a stolen democracy. If the U.S. ceases to be a functioning democracy, the consequences will extend far beyond its borders. America's role as a global leader would collapse. The U.S. could no longer promote democracy abroad while abandoning it at home. Authoritarian regimes would be emboldened. Dictators like Putin and Xi Jinping would celebrate the fall of American democracy, using it as proof that democratic systems are weak. Allies may distance themselves. Traditional allies in Europe and Asia could seek new leadership, unwilling to rely on a U.S. led by an authoritarian leader. The fall of American democracy would destabilize the entire global order, ushering in a new era of autocratic rule worldwide. Is it too late to save American democracy? The fight for democracy is not over, but time is running out. If Trump or his allies win in 2024, the U.S. may never have another truly free election. If voter suppression and election rigging continue unchecked, democracy will erode beyond repair. If Americans do not act now, they may wake up in a country where their votes no longer matter. The future of American democracy is hanging by a thread. The question is, will the people fight to save it, or will they allow it to slip away forever? Conclusion: the last election. Donald Trump has already tried to overthrow one election. If he returns to power, he will ensure that he never has to leave again. He has convinced millions that elections are fake. He has installed loyalists to oversee future elections. He has helped pass laws that allow election results to be overturned. A democracy cannot survive if one side refuses to accept defeat. If Trump's plan succeeds, 2024 may be the last truly competitive election the U.S. ever has. The next chapter will explore the final stage of Trump's strategy, creating a system where democracy is impossible to restore. Chapter 9: Can American Democracy Survive? For nearly 250 years, the United States has prided itself on being a beacon of democracy. Its institutions have endured civil war, world wars, economic crises, and political corruption. But today, the country faces a crisis unlike any before, a direct, sustained attack on the very foundation of its democratic system. Donald Trump's presidency was not just an isolated event. It was a stress test for American democracy. His attempt to overturn the 2020 election proved that the country's institutions are vulnerable to authoritarian takeover. Now, as Trump and his allies prepare for a possible return to power in 2025, the question is no longer whether he will try to dismantle democracy. It is whether America's institutions are strong enough to stop him. This chapter examines the current state of American democracy, the key threats to its survival, and what must be done to prevent the U.S. from becoming an authoritarian state. The fragility of American democracy. Many Americans assume that democracy is self-sustaining, that as long as elections are held, the system will continue. But history proves otherwise. Democracies can and do collapse, often through gradual erosion rather than sudden coups. How democracies die. Political scientists who study democratic backsliding have identified common warning signs that a democracy is in danger. 1. A leader who refuses to accept election results. 2. A political party that enables authoritarianism. 3. Attacks on independent institutions like the judiciary and media. 4. Efforts to restrict voting rights and rig elections. 5. The use of government power to punish political opponents. The U.S. is experiencing all 5 warning signs, making it one of the most at-risk democracies in the developed world. Key threats to American democracy. If the U.S. collapses into authoritarianism, it will not be because of a single event, but because of multiple ongoing attacks that gradually weaken the system. 1. The Republican Party's embrace of authoritarianism. The modern Republican Party is no longer committed to democracy. It has embraced Trump's lies, promoted election denialism, and passed laws that allow elections to be overturned. 70% of Republicans believe the 2020 election was stolen. Republican state legislatures have passed laws giving themselves power over election results. The GOP purges members who refuse to pledge loyalty to Trump. In a healthy democracy, both parties accept election outcomes, but today's Republican Party has rejected this fundamental principle, creating a scenario where future elections may not matter. 2. The courts are no longer a check on authoritarianism. While the judiciary played a role in blocking some of Trump's most extreme abuses, the Supreme Court and lower federal courts are now packed with Trump-appointed judges. The Supreme Court has overturned decades of precedent, proving its willingness to reshape the country along ideological lines. Lower courts have upheld voter suppression laws, making it harder for marginalized groups to vote. Trump's allies are pushing legal theories that could allow state legislatures to override election results. If the courts continue to act as a rubber stamp for Republican power, there will be no meaningful legal way to challenge election theft. 3. The media and information crisis. Democracy cannot function without an informed electorate, but Trump's war on truth has created two separate realities in America. Right-wing media outlets like Fox News, OANN, and Newsmax serve as propaganda arms for Trump's movement. Social media platforms are filled with misinformation and conspiracy theories that radicalize voters. Trump's attacks on journalists have made it dangerous to report the truth, leading to increased self-censorship. A democracy where millions of people believe lies over facts is a democracy that cannot function. 4. The growing threat of political violence. Trump's rhetoric has normalized the idea that violence is an acceptable political tool. The January 6 insurrection proved that Trump's supporters are willing to use violence to overturn elections. Far-right militias and extremist groups have grown in strength since Trump left office. Election officials, judges, and journalists have received death threats for opposing Trump's movement. In many failing democracies, political violence begins with isolated incidents before escalating into widespread suppression of opposition voices. The U.S. is moving dangerously in that direction. Can democracy be saved? Despite the threats, American democracy is not doomed, yet, but saving it will require action from voters, lawmakers, and institutions. 1. Protecting voting rights. The most important step to preserving democracy is ensuring that all Americans can vote freely and fairly. Federal legislation like the John Lewis Voting Rights Act must be passed to stop voter suppression. Gerrymandering reforms are needed to ensure fair representation in Congress. Election workers and officials must be protected from intimidation and threats. If voting becomes a privilege for the few rather than a right for all, democracy will not survive. 2. Holding Trump and his allies accountable. A democracy cannot function if its leaders operate with total impunity. Trump and those who attempted to overthrow the 2020 election must face legal consequences. The DOJ must prosecute those who plotted January 6, not just the rioters, but the officials who incited them. State and federal investigations into Trump's criminal activities must be allowed to proceed without political interference. Future leaders must know that attempting to steal an election will have consequences. If Trump returns to power without facing accountability, it will send a message that any future leader can break the law and get away with it. Strengthening democratic institutions. Trump exploited the weaknesses of America's democratic institutions. If democracy is to survive, those weaknesses must be fixed. Congress must pass laws to prevent election interference. Judicial reform is needed to prevent the courts from being politicized. Safeguards must be put in place to stop future presidents from abusing executive power. Democracy is not just about holding elections, it is about having strong checks and balances to prevent corruption. 4. Mobilizing the public. Ultimately, the survival of democracy depends on the American people. Voters must turn out in record numbers in 2024 and beyond to reject authoritarianism. Pro-democracy organizations must fight disinformation and protect election integrity. Activism is needed to pressure lawmakers to prioritize democratic reforms. Democracy is not self-sustaining. It requires constant effort and vigilance. Conclusion: the fight for America's future. The next few years will determine whether the U.S. remains a democracy or falls into authoritarianism. If Trump returns to power, he will never allow another fair election. If election denialism spreads, Americans will lose faith in democracy altogether. If democratic institutions are not protected, America will follow the path of failed democracies before it. The fight to save democracy is not just about Trump. It is about whether the U.S. can rebuild trust in its institutions and prevent future leaders from abusing power. The final chapter will explore what the worst-case scenario looks like and what happens if democracy collapses completely. Chapter 10: The Collapse of American Democracy. For most of its history, the United States has functioned under the belief that its democratic institutions are strong enough to withstand any challenge. But history tells a different story. No democracy is permanent. Nations that once seemed politically stable, like Germany in the 1930s, Venezuela in the early 2000s, or Hungary in recent years, have fallen into authoritarianism not through military coups, but through the gradual erosion of democratic norms. Now the U.S. stands at a crossroads. If Trump or his allies return to power in 2025, will American democracy survive, or will it collapse into an authoritarian regime? This final chapter will examine what happens if the worst-case scenario unfolds, exploring the consequences of a post-democratic America. How democracies collapse, the final stage. Political scientists have studied the decline of democracies around the world, and the patterns are strikingly similar. 1. Elections become meaningless. Once in power, authoritarian leaders change the rules to ensure they never lose again. 2. The legal system is weaponized. Courts, prosecutors, and law enforcement are used to crush opposition. 3. Independent media is destroyed. The press is censored, and propaganda replaces journalism. 4. Dissent is criminalized. Protests are outlawed, and critics face legal persecution or exile. 5. The regime normalizes violence. Political violence escalates, often targeting minority groups or opposition activists. These warning signs are already present in the U.S., and if Trump returns to power, these steps could happen at an accelerated pace. Scenario 1. Trump returns and establishes permanent power. If Trump wins in 2024, he will not govern like a traditional president. His team has already outlined plans to dismantle democracy from within. 1. The end of fair elections. Republican-led states will pass laws restricting voting rights, ensuring future elections favor them. The Supreme Court, stacked with Trump loyalists, will uphold new election laws that make it harder for non-Republicans to vote. State legislatures will be given the power to reject election results, ensuring Trump or his allies never lose again. Even if elections still happen, they will be rigged beyond repair. Number 2. A justice system that exists only to serve Trump. The Department of Justice and FBI will be purged of non-loyalists and used to target Trump's political enemies. Criminal cases against Trump, his family, and his allies will be dismissed immediately. Prosecutors will be ordered to investigate and jail Democrats, journalists, and activists under bogus charges. 3. The death of independent media. Trump will push for new laws to limit press freedom, labeling critical journalists as enemies of the state. Social media platforms will be pressured to suppress opposition voices. Right-wing propaganda outlets like Fox News and Newsmax will become the state-controlled media. 4. The normalization of political violence. Trump has already encouraged violence against his opponents. In a second term, he may endorse or excuse violent crackdowns on dissenters. Right-wing militias could be empowered as an unofficial police force, allowed to target protesters or political enemies. Federal law enforcement agencies could be used to suppress protests, intimidate opposition leaders, and silence activists. If Trump secures full control over elections, the courts, and the media, the U.S. would no longer function as a democracy. The country would still have elections, but their outcomes would be predetermined, just like in Russia, Turkey, or Hungary. Scenario 2. Trump loses, but his followers reject the results. Even if Trump loses in 2024, that does not mean democracy is safe. His movement has already shown a willingness to resort to violence to keep him in power. 1. A repeat of January 6, but worse. If Trump loses, he and his allies will immediately claim election fraud, no matter how clear the results are. His supporters could take to the streets, launching nationwide riots and armed uprisings. Right-wing militias and extremist groups could launch attacks on government buildings or political opponents. If Republican governors or legislatures refuse to certify the results, the election could be thrown into chaos. To a constitutional crisis unlike any before. If Republican-led states refuse to accept the results, America could face a total constitutional breakdown. Congress may be unable to certify the election, leading to mass protests, legal battles, and even military intervention. The Supreme Court, stacked with Trump appointees, could issue rulings that favor Trump, triggering an even greater crisis. In this scenario, the U.S. could descend into prolonged political violence, resembling the unrest seen in failing democracies worldwide. Scenario 3. A permanent one-party state. Even if Trump does not return in 2025, his movement has permanently reshaped the Republican Party. The GOP's efforts to rig elections, suppress votes, and dominate state legislatures could result in a one-party system where Republicans hold power indefinitely. Gerrymandering and voter suppression could lock Democrats out of power for decades. The Supreme Court and lower courts could continue rolling back voting rights, LGBTQ+ rights, and civil liberties. State legislatures could gain the power to overrule federal laws, making democracy functionally irrelevant in many parts of the country. In this scenario, the U.S. would still have elections, but they would exist in name only, like in Russia or Iran. What happens if American democracy dies? If the U.S. ceases to function as a democracy, the consequences will be felt worldwide. The U.S. will become an authoritarian state. Political dissent will be criminalized. Free press will be shut down or controlled by the government. Civil rights and voting rights will be stripped away, especially for marginalized communities. 2. Global democracy will crumble. The U.S. has long been a global symbol of democracy. If it falls, authoritarian regimes will be emboldened. Dictators in China, Russia, and the Middle East will use America's collapse as proof that democracy does not work. Autocrats worldwide will expand their own power, knowing the U.S. no longer stands for democratic values. 3. A period of unprecedented instability. If the U.S. collapses into dictatorship, it could face economic turmoil, mass protests, and internal conflict. Many Americans may flee the country, seeking refuge in more stable democracies. The possibility of a second civil war, while extreme, would no longer be unthinkable. The fall of American democracy would reshape the world order, triggering instability that could last for generations. Final thoughts. Can democracy be saved? The collapse of democracy is not inevitable, but the U.S. is dangerously close to the edge. If Trump and his allies win in 2024, democracy may never recover. If voter suppression and election rigging continue unchecked, elections will cease to matter. If Americans do not fight back, they may wake up in a country they no longer recognize. The fight for democracy is not over, but time is running out. If the U.S. does not take immediate action to protect its institutions, restore voting rights, and hold Trump accountable, it risks becoming another failed democracy, lost to history. Conclusion. The art of the steal. Donald Trump did not just steal an election, he stole America's trust in democracy itself. And if his movement is not stopped, he may succeed in stealing democracy forever. The only question left is, will Americans fight to take it back? The end, or the beginning of the fight for democracy.